So we're resuming for the last presentation of the workshop, and that honor is given to Leon and Amnon. You're going to chair the session. Amnon, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. It's been a fascinating discussion so far, or discussions, I should say, so far. We are now happy to host Leon Ritter from Ruhr University. Leon is studying cyber attacks, which is something I'm also very interested in. But more specifically, he's an expert also on China and the relationship, the complex relationship between China and the cybernetic dimension. And he will be addressing a very interesting question on the possible impact of the delineation of drawing the line between hate speech and protected speech, and its potential impact on the perception of free speech. Please, Leon, the floor is yours.
Thank you. A quick addition. I'm now employed at Hagen University and no longer at Freie University. And yes, I've got my stopwatch set and I'm now about to share my presentation. I hope you can see it. Is it working for you?
Yes.
Excellent. Yes, I am going to talk about the impact of national hate speech regulations on citizens' perceptions of the importance of protecting free speech. I'm not going to read out my abstract, which I somewhat foolishly neglected to add to my draft paper. It will be added to the finished paper, or at least in time for our Berlin workshop. And after a quick introduction and an effort to define hate speech for the purposes of my presentation, my paper, I'm going to give you a quick rundown of my theoretical and methodological approach before I will then delve into my comparative case studies, namely Germany, the United States of America, Japan, and Canada. And then I will be going to discuss my findings and draw a conclusion. Now, I should probably begin by explaining how this idea for a research project came to be. It was in the summer of last year when a survey made quite a bit of headlines in Germany, a survey conducted by the Institut für Demoskopie Allensbach, which revealed that for the first time in the 60 or 70 years since the survey had been conducted, a majority of German citizens no longer felt at ease expressing their personal political views. The survey was subsequently criticized on methodological grounds, and I myself have taken some umbrage at the way the survey was conducted. But I still thought that there may be something going on regarding the perceptions of free speech in Germany. And as the results of the survey came in at a time when there was a lot of discussion in the media about the Network Enforcement Act, a new law that had been designed to combat cyber crime and hate speech in Germany, I thought that perhaps it could be interesting to investigate if there was some sort of connection. The two fundamental assumptions under which I conducted my research are that free speech is not inherently bad and indeed something good that should be protected in a democratic society, and that minorities and vulnerable groups are in need of protection. You may think that these assumptions are self-evident, but there are outlier opinions of people that say that, for example, free speech is inherently in favor of those in power and a means to silence minorities. For example, Louis Michael Seidman made such a statement. But I operate under the assumption that free speech is inherently, fundamentally a good thing. My research is, of course, aimed at the possibility of finding lessons, of drawing lessons for the fight against hate speech without hopefully infringing upon the feeling of freedom of expression in the citizenry at large. So yeah, the question is, how does hate speech regulation affect citizens' perceptions? So I set out and formulated my hypothesis that stricter regulations of online hate speech have the side effect of positively affecting citizens' perceptions of the value of free speech. The reason why I came to this hypothesis is that the media discussion about the new laws that have been enacted that are more strict than all that came before may have had something to do with affecting the perceptions of citizens, and even that the thought of new regulations infringing upon the right to free expressions may make citizens value their constitutionally granted rights to free expression more strongly. In order to conduct a fruitful discussion of my hypothesis, it is of course necessary to define hate speech. I'm going to rush through this rather quickly because we've had a lot of talk about the possible ways in which to define hate speech. So of the multiple definitions, there was, of course, the caveat that I had to settle on a definition that was applicable to online hate speech, as my jumping off point had been a survey that had been conducted at a time when the regulation of online hate speech by law was the focal point of public discourse. And in the end, I settled on the definition by Liriam Sponholz, a gender studies scientist from Austria, who has done extensive work on cyber hate speech and its regulation. And she named 3 criteria: discrimination, communication, and publicness, to identify hate speech, which then needs to be framed by taking into account the speaker, the medium, and the audience, to ensure that discrimination and categorization are in place, which are the points that differentiate hate speech from other forms of cyber incivility, in her opinion. For my methodological approach, I chose a quantitative approach and sought for a way to code national legislation numerically and to test these numerically coded legislations against survey data that illustrates the attitudes of citizens on the questions that are of relevancy to me. I set out by taking a look at Alexander Brown's idea about the 10 clusters of hate speech, which I sought to code with a value of 1 each, except for clusters 2 and 10. Cluster 2 is about negative deceptions and stereotyping in media law, which lies outside of my field of interest. And cluster 10, which even Alexander Brown admitted is a borderline case if it is really applicable to hate speech. And all of the 10 clusters will be coded with a value of 1, except for cluster 5 and 9. Those will be coded with a value of 7.75 because they are on the softer side, so to speak, of hate speech regulations, cluster 5 threats to public order has been coded by me as 0.75 because, as I mentioned in my contribution to one of our discussions today, it neglects the psychological suffering of the survivors. And I also chose to code cluster 9, expression-oriented hate crimes, with a value of 0.75 because it is the softest, so to speak, and the most vaguely defined one. I will add a value of plus 0.5 to any legislation that allows for criminal proceedings, and a further plus 0.5 for legislation that allows for prison sentences, to measure the strictness, the toughness of the regulations. The thing about the clusters was more to measure the comprehensiveness of legislation. And I will deduct a value of 0.5 from any legislation that allows for a truth defense. Any legislation where criminal proceedings or any sort of legal proceedings can be shut down by proving the apparent truth of the statements in question, or even legislation where it is enough to have spoken in good faith, to have said something that was questionable and hateful, but that the person believed to reflect the true nature of things, will be understood as being softer than regulation that does not allow for truth defense. And finally, I'll add a value of +1 for each group that is identified as being protected under the legislation. The coded values will be tested against the survey data from the World Values Survey regarding how people understand the importance of freedom of speech, using a Pearson correlation coefficient. That's the formula for that. I'm not going to go into much detail on that. If you're working quantitatively, you will have seen it. And if you don't, you're probably not all that interested in the statistical side of things. So all you need to know is that X is the value of hate speech regulations as coded by myself, and Y is the data, the survey data drawn from the World Value Survey as researched by the World Value Survey team. Now I'll be going into my case studies. My first case study is Germany. I should probably mention of the 4 countries that I have selected in my case studies, why I chose them. The reason was that I wanted to cover a sample that was still manageable within the time frame I had, but still broad enough to cover a wide range of jurisdictions. And so I chose 2 common and 2 civil law systems. And I included Canada, the United States of America, Germany, and Japan, because I also wanted to cover a broader range of different cultures. And especially since the Japanese case has been very, very much understudied in Western contexts, I thought it would be interesting to include that one in my research. I also limited myself to countries that are considered free by the Freedom in the World Index of the Freedom House Foundation, because there is little point in discussing freedom of speech and versus hate speech in systems that are unfree, as such systems usually have problems in the human rights sphere that go beyond the mere freedom of expression. So there was very little point, in my opinion, in adding countries from that group that is considered partially free or unfree to my study. Now in Germany, we have a number of legislations that have seen considerable expansion over the time span that I am going to look at. And the laws that I focused on were the paragraphs 130, 131, 185, 186, 187, and 189 from the German Criminal Code. That is Volksverhetzung, incitement of the people, Beleidigung, insult, then üble Nachrede and defamation, basically, yeah, defamation and libel. And 189 is Verunglimpfung des Andenkens Verstorbener, desecration of the memory of the deceased. And I also looked at the law that was the catalyst for me choosing this research topic, the Gesetz zur Verbesserung der Rechtsdurchsetzung in sozialen Netzwerken, the law to improve enforcement of the law in social networks, usually shortened to Netzwerkdurchsetzungsgesetz, Network Enforcement Act, or simply NetzDG. When I looked at the laws in detail, more details of which can be found in the written paper, I did not want to bore you with the numerical details here. I found that the coded value on the toughness of hate speech regulations in Germany evolved from 13.8 prior to 2014 over a value of 22.1 in 2017 to a value of 33.4 from 2017 onwards, with the most recent amendments to the Network Enforcement Act not yet accounted for. Reason being that the survey data from the World Value Survey against which I chose to test my coded data does not cover the more recent years, as the current wave of the World Value Survey has not yet been released. There was no point in taking the most recent amendments to German law and contrasting them with survey data from 2017, as you can probably understand. So yeah, we have a value of 33.4 for 2017. The American case was quite simple. I only looked at federal legislation, and I also only looked at legislation as it was written. I did not consider case law. And over the time span for which I had survey data, there was no change whatsoever. The only law at the federal level that I had to look at was the Matthew Shepard and James Byrd Jr. Hate Crime Prevention Act, which I coded with a value of 2.35. Now, as for the Japanese case, that one was the most interesting one, because Japan didn't have any legislation on hate speech until 2016. Before that, there was absolutely no legislation criminalizing hate speech in any form or shape. The 2016 Honpongai Shishinsha ni taisuru futou na sabetsuteki gendo no kaisho ni muteka tomikuri no suishi ni kansuru horitsu, the Act on the Promotion of Measures to Eliminate Unjustifiable Discriminatory Treatment of Persons from Outside Japan, or Heito Speech Kaishoho, Hate Speech Elimination Act for short, was the law that I looked at, Law 68 from 2016. And you see that I marked the term Gendo in blue here, because that term is quite difficult to translate. It is compounded from the kanji for speech and action. So it's not just hate speech, but also hateful actions in general that are covered under this law. However, the clearly stated intent of the legislators was to develop a law in order to fight hate speech, which is why the shortened name of the law only has hate speech in the title. The law was conducted in an effort to oblige to international treaties that Japan had entered into, and that required the Japanese government to make a stronger effort to curb hate speech. Now, the law, as it was adopted in 2016, was quite weak. It only protects people of non-Japanese descent. The Hompo Ngai Shishinsha word is basically people from outside of our country when translated into English. And the law does not allow for criminal proceedings or even or prison sentences, and is very much rooted in the originally American understanding of the marketplace of free ideas concept, which allows for counter speech to be used to fight hate speech in vain of actual criminal sanctions. Considering the considerable weakness of the law, I coded it with a value of 0.6. That can't be right. It has to be 2.6. I'm sorry about that. That was a typo on my part. Now, as time is running, I'm going to move through the Canadian case rather quickly. The Canadian case was also subject to a very great amount of changes, mostly in one department, but I'll be getting to that shortly. The laws that I looked at were the Canadian Criminal Code, Section 181, Spreading False News, Section 318, Advocating Genocide, 319, Public Incitement to Hatred, and the Canadian Human Rights Act, with the Section 181, Spreading False News, having been repealed in 2019. But it's still going to factor into my analysis, as indeed the survey data against which I contrast my coded findings was from 2017. So the Canadian Criminal Code 181 was still very much in effect at that point. For the Canadian case, I produced a short table. Basically, the value evolved from 8.55 to 8.75 to 9.75. The changes in the coded values are mostly due to one singular factor, namely more groups of protected people being added to the lists in the written regulations. So, for example, people being discriminated against on the basis of their gender identity have been only added as part of the most recent wave of amendments. So for my discussion, as I said, I'm going to contrast these values against data from the World Value Survey, where people were asked what they thought was most important among a list of items. That is item Q154 in the most recent wave, and V62 and V71 in the waves previous to that. And I omit Canada from the sixth wave because it was not surveyed in 2017. Here you see the table of my data with X being the coded values for each state and Y being the World Value Survey data of people saying that the freedom of speech is the most important among the list of items the surveyors provided. Now, when adding this data into my survey, I'm sorry, something went a bit wrong with the formatting there. I arrived at a correlation coefficient of 0.704, indicating that yes, there is a correlation with people's perceptions of the importance of freedom of expression being positively affected by the toughness of hate speech regulations. So I concluded that the empirical data does indeed support my hypothesis, but I also have to acknowledge that more data sets will be needed to strengthen the robustness of my findings. More jurisdictions will have to be added, more sets of laws will have to be coded, and I will also need to account more strongly for media discourses as they happen at the time of hate speech legislation being strengthened and toughened up. And I will also need to try out other dependent variables, such as the importance of civil liberties in general, to see if there is another correlation that needs to be accounted for. And once I get to updating my findings with the most recent wave of the World Value Survey, I will also need to control for the effect of the COVID-19 crisis, as I believe that one did have a profound effect on people's perceptions of the importance of certain civil liberties. Also not accounted for are the actions by social network operators. So perhaps I will try to incorporate Balkin's pluralist model of speech regulation, but all of that is planned for the future. For my bibliography, please refer to my draft paper, also for a list of all court cases and pieces of legislation that I have cited. Those are listed in my draft paper. Yes, with that, I conclude my presentation. I thank you for your kind attention, and I'm very much looking forward to any questions and comments so that I can improve on my research for the second time we meet in Berlin.
Wonderful, Leon. Thank you very much. Quite an innovative study, quite an innovative quantitative study, I think. I have a couple of reflections, but I want to encourage the members of the workshop. If you have any comments or questions, please raise your hand. And of course, I will give you the floor or the screen or whatever one gives in Zoom conferences. But off the bat, I think that my comments are at three levels. One is the most basic level, and that has to do with the basics of methodology. Just a couple of methodological questions. I'm sure some of the methodology is going to be raised by people. I think that I was wondering whether the result changes and to what extent it changes if you don't differentiate between the various components. You don't give the 0.5 to one measure, but just give them all one. Unless you have a methodology, a strict methodology by which you can differentiate between the various components of what counts as hate speech or the bad things about hate speech, because otherwise why 1 and not 0.9 and not 0.3 and why 0.75? I just think that, think about that. Another, on the same level, these are not important things, but I just want to get them off the table. But when I read the papers, Canada, the Canadian Human Rights Act is not the important one, because in Canada it's federalism. So the important human rights codes are at the provincial level. So if you actually, people don't really care about the federal human rights code so much unless you work for the federal government or something like that. What applies to you is a provincial one, and then it may change. The same applies for case law. In Canada and the United States, what matters really is case law, because this is what changes the actual law. And this is what is being reported by the media. You talked about the media as a qualifier for the methodology. So people care about case law. So if you don't address case law, then there's a problem here. Of course, how you code it is a different question, but it stands for. Now, this is level number one, just in case of how you. You mentioned also the problem of media, because people care about media. I think that other studies on people's perception about the law suggest that people don't really know when laws are being changed, and they care about cases, not in a sense of legal cases, but in a sense of events in the media events. So if there's a very high visibility case in the sense of who did what to whom, for example, this morning we've heard from on the cases of police beating people in Israel from Asaf and Defat. Doesn't matter what the judge decided at the end, whether this was that or this was, people didn't even know about that. People knew about, wow, did you see what the police did to him? In this case, and this changes people's perceptions way more by orders of magnitude more than that. But so you know, and you touched about also the importance of the platform, that platforms, the reaction of platforms to several events is also important. But I think I want to move beyond those methodological questions to two other more, I think, deeper points. One is the issue of timing. You stopped at 2017 because of the data, but that doesn't allow you to fully experience the Trump era, because some would say that the entire presidency of Trump is one big hate speech. You know, whenever I don't want to overstate the claim, but plenty of times when the president of the United States spoke, other understood his speeches as a form of hate speech one way or another, because you know he was less let's call it delicately sensitive to the importance of protecting minorities and allowing them to participate, etc. So maybe maybe it would be interesting to do a post-Trump, pre-Trump notion. Now, the main point I want to discuss with you is the notion of what does it tell us that there is a correlation? Now, it could tell us that people care about speech because the regulation protects the ability to participate in the free marketplace of ideas. And people like that because they say, oh, wonderful. Now, because of hate speech regulation, I feel more free in a deeper sense. I have greater access. I can participate in the online conversation, in the platforms. Thank you very much. It's wonderful, and this is what hate speech law does. Assuming that the Japanese one is even at all a hate speech legislation, etc. Or you can look at it conversely. You can say, oh, they've just regulated speech. They shouldn't. I care about those issues. These are civil liberties. What is the government doing here? I care more about that because the notion of civil liberties is a negative notion of I need a protection from the government now. So, you know, I care because you infringed it. And both would actually meet your notion of correlation because you don't talk about, it's not even causality. I'm not talking about causality, but I'm talking about what correlation, even correlation, what it means. Some would even take, Sonia had a very interesting comment in the previous conversation. She said, look out, because whatever we do, the other side can also do, and they can use this in order to promote their agenda as well. So some people will say, oh, wonderful, if you want people to care about their rights, infringe their rights a bit, and then you will make sure that they really care about it. It's a wonderful idea to increase people. So the question is, are there any normative conclusions that one can draw from this correlation? Maybe not, but at least it should be explicit, I think, as part of our conversation. I end here my preliminary, and I see my dear colleague and friend, Anne, please lead us.
Well, actually, Amnon, I wanted to say the same thing on the question of how do we interpret this? So is this good news? So once people feel that their rights get infringed or regulated, they suddenly find it's an important right, even though before they might not have cared about it. But what follows from that? Right? Should we infringe them all a little bit so that they finally understand that their rights are under threat? Or what do we do? What follows normatively? So Amnon said it perfectly, so I'm not going to repeat it. But my question went in the same direction. The other thing I wanted to say is I think was the question of how information flows. And you said that in your conclusion that you wanted to add a media analysis. And I think that's important because you need to know, again, also how stable this sort of correlation is. So we have the NetzDG in Germany being discussed, and then suddenly people think about their free speech and all that. Do they, and how? So what are the information channels? And that you can easily do if you count Google searches or Twitter. You can scrap the data and do a text-less data analysis. But I think what would be necessary is to add a sentiment analysis and how exactly that is discussed. And that would maybe help a little bit on the question, what's really happening here in the discussion and which direction that goes. So I don't know how familiar you are with the methods, but it's improving currently a lot. So you might find some issues here. So Twitter or Facebook or Google searches. The Google searches are not that good because you only know that people are somehow giving an impact. But if you do Twitter or Facebook, you can do sentiment analysis, and you can do the same thing with the big newspapers as well. We're all online. So,
Leon, would you like to respond to those? Now you have a right to respond.
Yes, indeed. Thank you both for your feedback. I've been eagerly taking notes to improve on this draft. And you are right. I have been thinking about website scraping and doing content analysis of the data to better trace the effects. I have never tried it before. I'm aware of the method, but I have not yet tried it. But I think I should. After the points that you have raised, Anne, I really do believe that I should look into the possibilities for generating data against which to test my findings by using website scraping. And as for the point about the provincial Canadian human rights legislation and human rights codes, that is something I'm a bit angry at myself about, because I think what I should have done was just look at the individual provincial human rights codes and draw the mean average from them and contrast those against the National Federal Survey data for Canada. And as for case law, yes, there definitely is a need to go deeper into that in the case of common law systems. I had always been under the impression, from my limited understanding of how American media work, that the things that took place in the media discussions were actually the things that happened on the legislative side and not on the case law side so much, unless it is the Supreme Court coming to a revolutionarily new judgment. I always thought that the legislative process in the Congress received more attention than court decisions, which is why I did not cover US case law extensively. But perhaps I should rethink that decision. As I said, my window into the American media landscape is a bit limited. I mostly read Politico, and I don't think that is what most American citizens read. So I should probably broaden my view, so to speak. But thank you both very much for your feedback. It is very much appreciated.
Okay, thank you. I give the floor to Martin, and I see also the question of Rajesh about the definition. So Leon, you can also address this. I will read it out loud in a second, but Martin, please.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. I just want to make some some methodological remarks from my social science perspective. First, I appreciated this presentation. I like very much this interdisciplinary approach to combine this legal perspective with empirical data. So I think that's really an interesting approach, and I would motivate you to pursue that way. I think there's a lot of potential in it. From methodological side, you're working on the level of aggregate data, so very, very rough indicators on the level of countries, which always is a challenge for an empirical analysis, because there's a high risk of just detecting so-called spurious correlations. So just two parallel developments that look like they're connected, but they aren't. They're just parallel, but there's no causal relation. That's always the problem when interpreting such data. And that is a problem not easily to tackle, because you cannot run a real experimental design. So if you would be a dictator in a country, you could just test it by changing the law and then looking what happens with public opinion. That is something we cannot do. So we have to work with data that are available. There's one methodological idea, and that is first to increase the number of cases. So not just study 5 countries, but about 30, for example, which then would allow you to enter the field of statistical testing. Another idea would be to separate countries into 2 groups. One group with no or little change in law, and another group of countries with stronger change in law, and then test a hypothesis. For example, those countries with no or little change in law should show at least a lower increase in public awareness than those countries with stronger changes in law. That could be then a hard test and would provide you with stronger findings than just calculating a correlation over your group. And the second remark, just to finish this up, is what Amnon referred to. Amnon referred to a so-called mediation effect, as we call it, so that there's no direct connection between change of law and public awareness, but there may be a causal relation from change of law to a third variable, like media reporting on problems of hate speech, and then a second effect from media reporting on public awareness. And that is something, and you discussed that already, you could test and analyze by adding a content analysis part to your data collection.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. Those are great suggestions, and I may just implement them, especially the idea to split countries into 2 groups. I mean, yes, of course, I need to broaden my sample, and to tell the truth, I was a bit, I did not manage my time all that well, but now that I have more time at my hands, hopefully, I will be able to include more countries in my sample, and then indeed go down the route that you have suggested by splitting the sample into 2 groups, one with countries that experienced a lot of change in their hate speech regulations, and one that did not, and in that way ensure the validity of my findings. So yeah, that was a great suggestion, and I'm definitely going to be implementing that one. And yes, I will also try to look into the mediation effect. As I said, I've never done this sort of analysis before, but I assume that with enough time, I will be able to learn the relevant techniques and be able to master it. So,
it's a great opportunity, because I think a sentiment analysis actually tells us a lot about people's perception about the law more generally, and about courts, and about specific rights. It's a great tool that we haven't yet addressed. But here again, I think Martin's a good point also relates to something you, Leon, suggested. When you talk about change in law, it should be also relative to change in law with respect to other rights, right? You talked about the civil liberties more generally, because there could be a bleeding off effect, because people don't necessarily think, oh, this is about speech, I care about privacy, or I care less speech than privacy. So it might be more, oh, this notion of rights more generally, and then that comes in. So Rajesh asks us about the definition of hate speech. Maybe you care to say a little bit about what, a methodological concern could be that, that when you follow your list of indicators of what counts as hate speech, you're being less contextual than you should be.
I mostly chose the definition I used because it was the one that I felt was the most inclusive. Many definitions of hate speech that I saw were limited to speech that, for example, the Rosenfeld definition that we have already talked about today, limited to the dangers of inciting public violence. And by choosing such a restrictive definition of what hate speech is, I also limit myself in what counts as hate speech legislation, thereby reducing the amount of relevant legislation that I could incorporate into my study. So I used the definition that I felt could apply to most, if not all, laws that I would intuitively consider to be hate speech legislation. So that was the reason for that. Okay.
Do you also care to comment about the normative point of what do we make, assuming that, as Martin said, that these are not too, it's Wednesday and it's raining, but there's no relationship between Wednesdays and rain. But so assuming we deal with Martin's point, methodological point, what do you want to say about, what do we make about it normatively?
What we make from it normatively is, at this early stage of my research, just that there is a correlation that hate speech legislation does affect the perceptions of the importance of free speech. And further data will be required in order to correctly interpret the findings in a way that allows for normative conclusions. At this point, I did not feel comfortable making any claims, any sort of policy suggestions, for example, of how the data I found should be implemented. So, in my opinion, I'm not there yet.
Mm-hmm. Okay. There could be a third, just another. There could be a third, right? So one thing is that hate speech legislation responds to people's worries, and therefore people, because they care about it, the hate law speech are there to address demand. The other is the hate speech laws are the problem, and people care about the rights because they think that the hate law infringes. Now, there could be both, depending on which group you're in. If you're a minority, you think that, but if you're the majority, you think that. There could be. And then, there could be a third unrelated explanation, which deals with belief in democracy altogether. You mentioned this in your paper. Democracy cannot be taken for granted. Some people, worry about the liberal idea of democracy. Hate speech is one component thereof, but they worry about it much larger. They view that, capitalism is there, or surveillance capitalism is there, and the Chinese are so, or populism. The illegal immigrants are taking over Europe or whatever people care about, and therefore it's a totally different. It's part of a totally different picture. So I think I don't know, but I think it might be worthwhile to at least raise hypothesis or hypothetical narratives within which to situate your findings. Otherwise, the question is, okay, so there's a correlation. And then what? But maybe other people want to jump into the conversation. I see other comments in the chat. I see Morten's comment. This is an interesting comment about the level. We used to call it regionalism at one point when we were interested in Europe, European studies. So the question, you mentioned national hate speech, but maybe it's regional, municipal, or EU level, or transnational because of Trump, or because of, so at which level you think the effect lies? This is another input from the chat. So maybe you want to comment on your choice to focus on national hate speech and not regulation, and not communities lower than that or higher than that.
Am I supposed to answer? Because I don't think the question was addressed to me, but
I think it's a general question. You can. Okay. And we can also save some of it to. Ido said that we will have at the end some time to discuss the next stage. So maybe some of those comments could be addressed there. But or maybe Rajesh would like to address the issue more directly. Don't see you here, but.
Yeah, am I audible?
Yes, now we hear you. Yes.
Yeah. Good afternoon, everyone. Yeah, what I want to say is that the hate speech should be looked from the perspective of the person who has become victim, and that person's cultural background, religious understanding, and legal understanding about civil rights is the dominant factor which determines whether that person is feeling as a victim or not. And all these depends on country to country, region to region, even the under social backing where the person grown up. So a common word hate speech cannot be put into a strict straitjacket formula that, okay, this will be the hate speech, this will not be. Another factor, as you already have discussed, that media can portray things in a very different way. And if a section of media is focusing only certain speeches against certain community only, and not taking care of the speeches which are given against the majority community, then it creates a kind of environment that in that particular country, in that particular social settings, a minority is being treated in negative way, or minority is targeted through hate speech. So what I say is media is playing a very, very big role in determining whether a speech is a hate speech or not. Sometimes even the selected statements in the name of hate speech are being used. We call it fake news later on, but impact is already there. At the ground level, people are taking law in their hand because of fake news. So it's a very, difficult area to create a international definition for that. it should be country specific. Even in country specific, the factors which combining the social construct of a country should be looked into. So that's what I want to contribute in your discussion. Leon presented a very good way. Thanks, Leon.
Thank you for your comment. I'll be taking note of that. If I'm looking down during the discussion, it's because I'm taking notes down here. It's not because I'm being unpolite.
Yeah, but there is a question of transferability of definitions, you know, whether you can even say something that is cross-cultural because hate speech is so cultural. So that should be addressed. Eva, please.
Thank you. And yeah, congrats, Leon, for the presentation and the paper. My comment is a bit more generic about the discussion in itself. And I just wanted to note that at times we've been using illegal immigrants to refer to refugees in Europe. But from a human rights perspective, I just wanted to bring that into the discussion, and that it would be important to, because that already there has already an assumption that's often undermining for their own process of asylum seeking and all that. So I just wanted to bring that into the discussion, because of course it also relates to the topic in a way, and to how we use how we use narratives and expressions. Thank you.
Of course, I think that that's a very good point, because whatever term we use, any term we use is subject. I don't think there's any neutral terms. But that doesn't mean, and again, you know, it's a legal point. I think that if somebody says you have illegal immigrants, it doesn't mean that they don't deserve full rights, even if they cross the border without the proper documentation, and therefore they're illegal. It doesn't mean, but you're right that we should be mindful about those points. Sonia, please.
Thank you. Also, thank you, Leon, for this interesting presentation and your draft paper. I wanted to come back to the methods questions and the ideas that Martin was putting forward, and also the comments about how maybe media reporting should be integrated, and you were talking about content analysis and web scraping and sentiment analysis, and although I agree that this would be really interesting and relevant for what you want to know, I would just put forward that it's also kind of it is also tricky and would be involving learning a lot of techniques, I guess, and also software wise. So I was thinking maybe there is another option that could be interesting, and then and this would be to maybe do more qualitative case studies for those countries that you already included into your correlation analysis, and then maybe you could also work with putting other research together on how on the media debates, for example, or debates in public on this topic, and look into then media discussions around certain key events that happened in the time frame you're interested in, as Amnon said, and I would agree with him that there are so-called key events that are relevant for media reporting, and then you could try and identify these events and then do a more qualitative analysis of how media framed the issue before and after, something like this. And maybe this you could also consider something like this.
Thank you. And you are right. Learning the techniques for website scraping, media scraping would indeed entail quite a lot of effort.
I mean, another option is to partner up with someone who's doing this. I don't know what kind of what the aim qualification-wise is of this work you presented, but this would be another idea.
Thank you. I think I may know people who can at least help me get into the relevant techniques, but I'll take a look at it.
Again, I want to second this again, and I think that when you do this, I think a criteria might be, again, something that was raised before. Media, just like Eva said, with respect to the terms we use, the media is also not neutral in the sense that there are groups. I mean, there are papers that have a certain flavor or hue, political hue or political flavor. And of course, we know when we analyze the online world that there are sites where people of a certain viewpoint, this is where they create their own filter bubble or echo chamber or however you would like to call it. So I think an important sub-question to your question is, does it matter? Does your political affiliation or worldview or sentiment, however you want to call your political sentiment more broadly, corresponds with what you think about free speech? And again, to talk about it in the US context, part of the highly motivating, at least rhetoric, among the alt-right is speech. They say those progressives, you can't talk now freely because those progressives, they want to change, they want to manipulate your consciousness by telling you how to speak about things. So it's a speech-based justification for their illiberal worldview, for their populist and illiberal worldview, but it's nonetheless speech-based. So when universities say to some of these people, there's a problem when you talk to students in universities, we're not going to invite you or something like that, they view it as a violation of their free speech rights. This is a classic US media event. The University of Berkeley had to spend $600,000 for choppers circulating outside and guarding the campus because they were ordered to invite one of those alt-right speaker to address the students there. So, there might be a differentiation between it would be important and interesting to see the possible variations with respect to perception as correlated with the websites or media or whatever that from which you take your information, something like that. Okay, do we have any further comments? Oh, Carolina, yes, please.
Thank you. Again, thank you for a great presentation, really illuminating. And I've said this before, I'm not an expert on legal matters, so I'm really, really learning a lot, and those perspectives are so valuable. My comment is less on your presentation, Leon, and more on the discussion that's unraveling now on the media discourses. And I've been thinking how this is something that is changing really fast because, as Amnon said, we have the bubbles in which people sort of function, and that's true of both the traditional media, because if someone kind of looking at sort of how it was until recently, if someone kind of deemed it worthy spending money on the physical newspaper, probably they already kind of align their views with that specific newspaper. But then we also have these newspapers now moving online, and the readership online is not necessarily the same as those physical newspapers. And then we look at who comments on online articles of those newspapers, something that I look at in our research as well. And we see that very often the readership of those newspapers is not as obvious as it was even a few years ago, because very often someone comes to comment on an article with the aim of attacking that point of view traditionally aligned with the publication. So the idea of media, of analyzing media discourses is becoming more complicated because, like I said, the readerships are more and more muddled, more and more overlapping, and less obvious. And I think it's something that perhaps we have to just think in terms of kind of fast shifting, shape shifting phenomenon, even, which in itself is really interesting, of course, but is worth remembering if we're planning to do research around or along the lines of, for example, newspapers we mentioned. If we're looking at this kind of methodology that we mentioned earlier, this is more a comment kind of from my experience, our experience in our project, how looking at even mainstream newspapers is, like I said, just less obvious and more challenging, but also because of that more interesting. So hopefully that's something, I don't know, we can all see in the next, in the next years develop even further.
Okay, wonderful. Any further comments or suggestions before we take a break? Yes, Tegan.
It's just a quick comment, just because I wasn't going to say anything. I don't think it's as relevant to the discussion on your presentation, Leon, which was very, very interesting. And this statistical sort of quantitative stuff is very new and different. So it's very cool to see how this operates. And maybe more, this will be a discussion we could all have in person in Berlin, but I think it's relevant to at least make a comment of it, because it was at the beginning. When you were talking about the, I don't know what the right word would be, the model offered by Alexander Brown and the initial part, the categorizations almost. I just want to say there's a lot of issues with the truth defense concept, about whether, I would say, the exceptionism that we kind of have sometimes, if somebody can sorry, I'm being asked to share my video. I've moved. There's an issue with this truth defense thing, and I didn't speak much about my PhD research, but I look at specifically religiously motivated hate speech specifically argued to be motivated either by Christianity or Islam against queer people, so the LGBTIQ community. And this exceptionism of the truth defense, or that the intention of the hate speaker has a truth. So say anti-trans speech, people have a concept of biological determinism. So they have, people are born male and female, blah, 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 they've got all their things, and thus they can justify their hate speech by the truth defense. Similar, I mean, you could argue with a lot of stuff that's happened to the homosexual community, but then, I mean, we can go very far. We have with eugenics the concept at some stage, a lot of scientific information put that people of different races are of different intellectual abilities, physical abilities, blah, 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 different race. There's a lot of problems with this historically. And I just wanted to point out that there's this truth defense, even as a concept, is very messy, because truth is also, I think, truth and fact, and how people also use like scientific basis for discrimination. It still happens in a lot of places. It's just something to be aware of. And I actually, when I started my PhD, I ended up in this thing because of my supervisor, and I met Alexander Brown, and this thing came up, the specific example about anti-trans hate speech, and like, but what if somebody truly believes, or they have the scientific backing about, you know, maybe sex and gender and the distinction and all that stuff. And he didn't have an answer. And then I was kind of like, well, that's very awkward now, because I have to write a PhD related to this. So if one of the experts doesn't have an answer, where do we go? But I wanted to mention that. So, but thank you for your presentation, and I look forward to like following it.
Thank you, Tegan. Anna, yes.
Yeah, just very quickly, because the discussion revolves around it. What I can do, Leon, is I can send you a paper of mine with a PhD student, and we did something for trade preferences. So we looked at parliamentary debates in 5 countries along 30 years, and the newspapers. So as Amnon suggested, one from the more right, one from the more left, and I think we cover Canada, US, Australia, India. So that might, India, you can't do parliamentary debates because they're not really well published, and some sentiment analysis. So maybe, just looking at the footnotes and what we reference, you find the papers on how to do that, and the databases you can use also for your purposes. So I'm happy to send that to you.
That would be really great if you could send that to me. Do you have my email address? Or?
No, I don't. Can you write me an email?
Yes. Your email address, is it somewhere?
Just Google me, you'll find me.
We'll circulate the emails among the participants, so you'll have each other emails. I'm sure Ido will be able to do that, and we'll have an email list of everybody. Before I give the floor back to Leon to say some just a final word, I want to also acknowledge what Tegan said now with respect to what counts as a defense. And there is a distinction here between truth and good faith or belief in truth. And this is a vexing question. Even in Israel, we have a law against Holocaust denial. So Holocaust denial is a crime in Israel, only as of 1986, by the way. But the law has an exemption. So if it's made out, if somebody denies the Holocaust or the extent of it in good faith and with the motivation to generate academic discourse or something like that, then it's not a crime in Israel. So those are always vexing question. Leon, do you want to say a couple of concluding words because our time is up?
Well, thank you all for your contributions to our discussion and for your feedback. And I'm very much looking forward to implementing the things you have said and suggested. And I'll be very interested in seeing how my paper will be able to evolve until we meet again in Berlin, hopefully.
Okay, thank you very much.